Before there were stadiums, before roaring crowds and raised torches, there was only silence drifting across a wide Greek valley. Imagine standing there in the early morning, when the air is cool enough to tighten the skin, and the ground still holds the memory of night. No banners flap in the wind. No music plays. Just birds, distant water, and the unsettling sense that something important is waiting to happen, though no one yet knows what it is. The question lingers in the stillness like a held breath. Why would human beings one day travel for weeks, risk injury, even death, for games that offered no gold, no riches, and no guarantee of survival? It is easy from the comfort of the modern world to see the Olympic Games as celebration, entertainment, or international unity. But that understanding is dangerously incomplete. In their earliest form, the Games were not created to make people happy. They were born from fear, devotion, rivalry, and a deep anxiety about the gods. They emerged from a world where storms were messages, earthquakes were punishments, and victory was believed to come not from talent alone, but from divine favor that could be granted or withdrawn without warning. In ancient Greece, life was fragile. A failed harvest could starve an entire village. A sudden illness could take a child overnight. War was not an exception. It was a constant presence, simmering between city-states like an unhealed wound. Men trained to fight almost as soon as they could walk, because survival demanded it. Yet within this vile and uncertain world, the Greeks carried a strange and powerful belief that the gods were always watching, always judging, and always demanding respect. To live well, in their eyes, was not simply to survive. It was to live in harmony with forces far greater than oneself. And harmony, paradoxically, often required struggle. Long before the first Olympic race was ever recorded, the Greeks told stories of heroes who proved their worth not through comfort, but through suffering. Strength was admired, but endurance was revered. Discipline mattered more than ease. To push the body to its limits was not foolishness. It was a way of speaking to divine in a language the gods understood. Sweat, pain, and perseverance became offerings just as meaningful as incense or sacrifice. As the morning sun rises higher over that imagined valley, casting long shadows across the land, it becomes clear that this place is not ordinary ground. Even before the games, Olympia was sacred. The earth itself was believed to hum with power. Tall olive trees grew slowly here, their twisted trunks shaped by time rather than force. Nearby rivers moved patiently, as if they too understood the weight of centuries. This was a place where people came not to conquer, but to kneel. And yet, reverence alone does not explain what was about to unfold. There is something deeply human and slightly unsettling about competition. To measure oneself against another is to risk humiliation as much as glory. To lose is to be exposed. To win is to invite envy, resentment, and the crushing pressure to never fall again. Why, then, would an entire civilization ritualize this danger? Why would they turn comparison into ceremony? The answer lies in fear, but not the kind that makes one run away. This was a fear that demanded structure, a fear of chaos, of meaningless death, of lives ending without recognition. In a world where fate seemed arbitrary, the games offered an illusion of order. Here, at least, outcomes followed rules. Here, strength could be tested openly. Here, excellence could be witnessed, remembered, and woven into story. But the calm surface hides a darker truth. These early competitions were not safe. Injuries were common. There were no referees as we know them, no medical teams waiting on the sidelines. A single misstep could cripple a man for life. And yet they came, from distant cities, from rival states, sometimes even from places that had been enemies only days before. This contradiction between danger and devotion is a heartbeat of the ancient Olympics. As listeners, drifting gently into this story, it is important to let go of modern assumptions. The people who gathered at Olympia were not chasing personal dreams in the way athletes often do today. They were participating in something much larger and more unsettling. Each contest was a question posed to the gods. Am I worthy? Has my city honored you enough? Will you favor us or punish us in the months to come? Winning was never just personal. A victor carried the pride of his entire city-state on his shoulders. His success was seen as proof of divine approval. his failure, sometimes, as a warning, and then there is the silence between events. The moments no one talks about, the hours before competition, when athletes lay awake on hard ground, listening to their own breathing, when doubt crept in quietly, asking whether devotion had been enough, whether prayers had been heard, whether the gods might choose someone else instead. These are the moments that feel closest to us now, thousands of years later. The human mind, restless in the dark, has not changed as much as we like to believe. As this story begins, there is no clear starting line, no trumpet announcing history's turning point, only a slow gathering of intention, a shared belief that the body, when tested honestly and publicly, could become a bridge between mortals and immortals, that running, wrestling, throwing, and enduring could somehow hold the universe in balance, even if only for a few days. Soon, this quiet valley will fill with dust and footsteps. Voices will rise. Rivalries will harden. Traditions will take shape, and rules will be remembered, then rewritten. But for now, at the very edge of the story, everything is still fluid, fragile, possible. And as we move deeper into this ancient world, one thought should remain gently in the background, like a distant drumbeat. The Olympic Games did not begin as a celebration of peace. They began as an answer to fear, a way to confront uncertainty with ritual, a way to look at suffering and say, quietly, that it meant something. The flame, when it finally comes, will not only light a stadium, it will illuminate a civilization's deepest hopes and anxieties. And once lit, it will be very difficult to extinguish. Before the Olympic Games gave Greece a shared rhythm, the land itself felt fractured, as though every hill and coastline carried a different heartbeat. There was no single Greece in the way we imagine nations today. Instead, there were hundreds of independent city-states scattered across mountains, valleys, and islands, each fiercely protective of its identity. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Argos, each believed itself unique, chosen, and often superior. Travel between them was slow and dangerous, and trust rarely extended beyond one's own walls. In this world, peace was not the natural state. It was a temporary pause between conflicts. Wars flared up over borders, honor, trade routes, and ancient grudges no one could fully remember anymore. Even when weapons were set aside, suspicion lingered. Men carried the memory of violence in their posture and speech. Children grew up hearing stories not of distant lands, but of battles fought close to home. Survival required alertness. Strength was not admired for its beauty, but for its necessity. Life followed the seasons with unforgiving precision. When the rains came too late, or not at all, hunger spread quickly. When storms battered the coast, fishermen did not return. Disease moved silently through crowded homes, indifferent to prayer or status. The gods were blamed, pleaded with, praised, and feared in equal measure. Every misfortune demanded interpretation. Every stroke of luck raised questions about who had earned divine favor and who had not. Religion was not a separate part of life. It was a framework through which everything else was understood. To the ancient Greeks, the gods were not distant or abstract. They were emotional, unpredictable, and deeply involved in human affairs. A sudden victory in battle meant a god had intervened. A devastating loss meant someone had failed in their duties. The world felt personal, watched, and judged. Yet beneath the constant tension, there was also an unspoken longing, a desire for moments when fear could be set aside, when rivalry could transform, even briefly, into something structured and contained. The Greeks were not blind to the cost of endless conflict. They simply lacked a shared language for peace. In villages and city-states alike, physical contests already existed. Young men raced each other across fields, wrestled in dusty courtyards, tested their throwing arms with stones or spears. These activities were not called sports. They were preparation, training for war, ways to prove readiness and weed out weakness. But even in these informal challenges, something else was present, an unmistakable thrill, a sense that being watched, measured, and remembered mattered. Stories began to circulate, as stories always do. Tales of heroes who could run faster than others, who never tired, who fought not just enemies but fate itself. These stories were repeated around fires at night, passed from father to son, shaped and reshaped by memory. Over time, the line between myth and reality blurred. What mattered was not whether the stories were true, but what they taught. That excellence was worth striving for, and that effort itself held value. At the same time, the Greeks believed deeply in balance. Excess was dangerous. Arrogance offended the gods. To rise too high invited punishment. This belief created a tension at the heart of their culture. They admired greatness, yet feared it. They celebrated strength, yet warned against pride. Somewhere within this contradiction, the idea of formalized competition began to take shape. Imagine a gathering where rival cities could meet without immediate bloodshed, where strength could be displayed openly, yet controlled by ritual, where honor could be won without killing, and rivalry could be acknowledged without destroying entire communities. Such an idea may seem obvious now, but in a world defined by violence, it was quietly revolutionary. Before Olympia became central, sacred festivals already existed. Religious gatherings where sacrifices were made, songs were sung, and communities came together under the watchful eyes of the gods. These festivals offered rare moments of shared identity. People from different regions stood side by side, united not by politics, but by belief. Over time, physical contests slipped naturally into these gatherings, not as entertainment, but as offerings, proof of devotion made visible through effort and pain. The land itself shaped these early ideas. Greece was rugged and demanding. Mountains cut cities off from one another. Valleys forced communities to become self-reliant. The sea connected distant places, but only to those brave enough to face it. To live here required adaptability, endurance, and resilience. These traits were admired because they were necessary. As generations passed, informal contests began to feel insufficient. If the gods were to be honored properly, the offerings must be meaningful. Random races and casual wrestling lacked the gravity such rituals demanded. What was needed was structure, rules, a place where tradition could be anchored and memory preserved. This is where contrast becomes important. The pre-Olympic world was loud with conflict, yet quiet in its rituals. Strength existed everywhere, but recognition was fleeting. A man might prove himself in battle and still be forgotten within a season. There was no lasting record, no shared calendar of achievement. Time moved forward without pause, swallowing victories and defeats alike. The idea of recurring games, held at regular intervals, offered something new: continuity, a rhythm that transcended individual lifetimes. To compete was not just to test oneself, but to insert one's effort into a long, unfolding story. Even failure gained meaning when witnessed and remembered. And so, slowly, without a single moment of invention, the conditions for the Olympic Games assembled themselves. Fear created the need. Belief gave it form. Geography shaped its values. Human longing breathed life into it. As this section of the story settles, it becomes easy to understand why the Games did not emerge in times of comfort. They arose because life was hard, uncertain, and often cruel. In that environment, people searched for something stable, something repeatable, something that suggested the world was not entirely governed by chaos. The ancient Greeks did not yet know what the Olympics would become. They did not imagine centuries of tradition or distant futures. They simply sensed that the world before them required a response, something that acknowledged struggle rather than denied it. And so, from a fractured land and restless people, the first threads of shared ritual began to weave themselves together, quietly, patiently, waiting for a place sacred enough to hold them. Long before crowds arrived, long before voices echoed across stone and dust, the valley of Olympia rested in a kind of deliberate quiet. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting. Two rivers moved to the land here, the Alpheus and Cladius, their waters slow and patient, cutting gently through soft earth as they had done for countless generations. The air carried the scent of damp soil and wild growth, and the ground beneath one's feet felt older than memory itself. To ancient eyes, this place did not feel accidental. Olympia was not chosen because it was convenient or impressive in the way cities were. It had no great walls, no harbors, no marketplace buzzing with trade. Instead, it felt removed from the noise of ordinary life, set slightly apart from the urgency of survival. That separation mattered. Sacred spaces, in the Greek imagination, needed distance from daily struggle. The gods were not to be honored in crowded streets, but where the world slowed enough to listen. Tall olive trees dominated the landscape, their leaves catching light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though the sun lingered there longer than elsewhere. These trees were not planted quickly or harvested aggressively. They grew slowly, stubbornly, twisting into shapes that reflected time rather than control. To sit beneath them was to feel small, not in a humiliating way, but in a humbling one. The land did not invite conquest. It invited reflection. The Greeks believed certain places were charged with divine presence, though no one could fully explain why. Olympia was one of those places. Even before temples rose or statues were carved, people came here to leave offerings. Small ones at first. A figurine shaped from clay, a strip of cloth, a whispered prayer carried on the wind. These gestures were not organized, but they accumulated, layering belief upon belief until the valley itself felt thick with intention. There were stories, too, as there always are, stories of gods walking unseen through the trees, of thunder rolling unnaturally close, of sudden clarity felt by those who slept on the ground here, as if dreams carried sharper meaning. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the fact that people believed them. Belief reshapes perception. A place becomes sacred because enough minds agree that it is. Unlike cities shaped by human ambition, Olympia remained largely untouched. That restraint was important. To build too much, too quickly, risked offending the gods. Sacred ground demanded humility. When structures did appear, they were simple at first, blending into the landscape rather than dominating it. Stone was placed carefully, not to show power, but to mark reverence. In this valley, time behaved differently. Days felt longer. Sounds traveled farther. A footstep echoed more clearly. A voice lingered in the air before fading. It was easy to imagine that the gods, if they were listening anywhere, would hear prayers spoken here more distinctly than elsewhere. This sense of presence shaped behavior. People lowered their voices without being told. Movement slowed. Even rivals, accustomed to suspicion and hostility, found themselves less inclined toward immediate conflict. The land itself imposed a kind of calm authority. Violence felt out of place, not forbidden, but inappropriate, as if the ground might remember it. The rivers played a quiet but crucial role. Water, in Greek thought, was cleansing and boundary-making. To cross a river often symbolized transition. Here, the flowing water marked a shift from the ordinary world into something set apart. Washing before rituals was common, not for hygiene, but for symbolic renewal. The body was prepared not just to be seen by others, but to be seen by the divine. As gatherings became more frequent, paths formed naturally. Feet wore them into the earth without planning or command. Where people walked repeatedly, meaning followed. Over time, these paths connected altars, trees, and open spaces, subtly organized in the valley without formal design. Olympia was shaped by repetition rather than instruction. What is striking is how little noise there was in these early days. No cheers, no applause. When people came together here, it was often in quiet observation, watching sacrifices, listening to prayers, standing still. In a culture filled with argument, debate, and rivalry, such stillness was rare. It trained a different kind of attention, one that turned inward as much as outward. This atmosphere made Olympia uniquely suited to what would come later. Athletic competition, when it arrived, did not feel intrusive. It felt like an extension of something already present. Bodies moving with purpose mirrored rivers flowing toward the sea. Struggle fit naturally into a place where effort already carried spiritual weight. The land did not promise safety. Summer heat could be punishing. Dust clung to skin. Insects gathered near water. Yet discomfort was not seen as a flaw. Hardship, endured willingly, sharpened devotion. To sweat in Olympia was to participate in its meaning. To feel fatigue was to acknowledge human limitation in the presence of immortal forces. As night fell, the valley transformed again. Firelight flickered against tree trunks and stone. Shadows lengthened and shifted, giving shape to imagination. It was easy in such moments to believe that unseen eyes watched from beyond the light, that something ancient stirred just beyond perception. This is the Olympia that existed before fame, before records, before rules etched into memory, a place defined not by what happened there, but by what could happen. Potential hovered in the air, quiet but insistent. In such a setting, the idea of gathering to test a body gained a deeper meaning. Strength demonstrated here was not merely physical. It was symbolic. A runner crossing open ground did so beneath the same sky as the gods. A wrestler struggling in the dust did so on earth already marked by prayer. Every movement felt observed, not just by human eyes, but by forces far older and less forgiving. This is why Olympia mattered. Not because it was central, but because it was separate. Not because it was loud, but because it was listening. The land itself became a silent witness, ready to remember what people would bring to it. And soon, they would bring much more than offerings. They would bring ambition, rivalry, devotion, and fear. They would bring their bodies, trained and trembling, into this quiet valley and ask it to hold their struggle. The ground would not answer in words. It never did, but it would hold their footsteps all the same, and that would be enough to begin something that would outlast them all. In the ancient Greek mind, the world was not governed by chance. Every crack of thunder, every sudden storm, every unexpected victory or crushing defeat carried intention behind it. At the center of this vast and emotional universe stood Zeus, ruler of the sky, keeper of oaths, and final judge of gods and mortals alike. His presence was not abstract or symbolic. It was immediate, personal, and often terrifying. To honor Zeus was not merely tradition. It was survival. At Olympia, Zeus was more than a god among many. He was the reason the valley mattered at all. The towering statue that would one day stand there, crafted from ivory and gold, did not create his authority. It reflected it. Even before temples rose, Zeus was believed to inhabit the space itself. The open sky above Olympia was his domain, and anything done beneath it unfolded under his watchful gaze. This belief shaped everything. To swear an oath in the name of Zeus was to bind oneself to truth with the highest possible stakes. Breaking such an oath invited not just social shame, but divine punishment. The gods, and Zeus most of all, were thought to despise deception. Strength gained through dishonesty was hollow. Victory achieved through cheating was dangerous. Zeus did not reward cleverness that undermined order. He rewarded discipline, respect, and balance. Thunderstorms carried particular weight. When lightning split the sky, it was understood as Zeus speaking in his own language. These moments inspired awe, but also fear. The Greeks did not imagine Zeus as endlessly forgiving. He was known for sudden anger, for decisive action, for enforcing limits. Mortals who reached too high, who let pride outrun humility, were often struck down not because they were weak, but because they forgot their place. This tension between aspiration and restraint lay at the heart of the Olympic Games. To compete was to seek excellence. To seek excellence was to approach the realm of the gods. But to cross into arrogance was to invite ruin. The Games became a controlled space where this dangerous dance could unfold safely, or at least more safely than elsewhere. Every athlete who entered Olympia understood this, whether consciously or not. Training the body was not enough. One had to train the spirit as well. Before competition, oaths were sworn before statues of Zeus. These oaths were not ceremonial decorations. They were promises made under threat of divine retribution. Athletes vowed to compete honestly. Judges swore to rule fairly, and even spectators were reminded of the sacred nature of what they witnessed. Sacrifice played a central role. Animals were offered to Zeus, their smoke rising toward the sky. The act was not casual or routine. It was heavy with meaning. Life was given in recognition of life's fragility. Blood reminded everyone present that existence itself was borrowed, not owned. In return, participants hoped for favor, or at least neutrality. To be ignored by Zeus was often considered better than to attract his displeasure. The idea that physical excellence pleased the gods may seem strange to modern ears, but to the Greeks it made perfect sense. The body was a gift. To neglect it was disrespectful. To push it thoughtfully, to test its limits while honoring its constraints, was a form of gratitude. Sweat became sacred. Pain, when endured without complaint, became a language of devotion. Yet Zeus was not only feared, he was also admired. He represented order in a chaotic world. While other gods embodied passion, jealousy, or trickery, Zeus stood for structure. He upheld cosmic balance. When disputes arose among gods themselves, Zeus decided their outcome. This authority made him uniquely suited to preside over competitions meant to resolve rivalry without bloodshed. At Olympia, rival city-states brought their tensions with them. Old grudges did not disappear at the riverbanks. But under Zeus's authority, these conflicts were contained. The games offered a substitute for war, a symbolic battlefield, where strength could be proven without annihilation. Zeus did not erase rivalry. He regulated it. There is something deeply calming in this idea, even now. The belief that chaos can be held within ritual, that violence can be transformed into effort, that rivalry can be acknowledged without destruction. For the ancient Greeks, this belief was not philosophical. It was practical. As the sun moved across the sky during the games, Zeus's presence was constantly reinforced. No roof separated athletes from the heavens. Every race unfolded beneath open air. Every contest was framed by sky. There was nowhere to hide from the god who ruled it. This exposure mattered. It reminded participants that nothing was truly private, nothing unseen. At night, when fires burned low and exhaustion settled into bodies, thoughts often turned back to Zeus. Had he approved? Had the sacrifices been enough? Had pride crept too close to arrogance? Sleep came slowly in such moments, filled with dreams that felt weighted with meaning. Over time, Zeus became inseparable from the identity of the games. Other gods were honored, certainly, but Zeus stood at the center, anchoring the entire tradition. His authority gave the Olympics legitimacy beyond human law. Rules were followed not just because judges enforced them, but because breaking them risked cosmic consequences. This is why the games endured, not because they were entertaining, but because they were believed to matter on a scale larger than human life. To compete at Olympia was to step into a relationship with the divine. To win was to feel momentarily aligned with Zeus's favor. To lose was not simply failure, but a message, sometimes unclear, sometimes painful, but always taken seriously. As this part of the story settles, the listener can sense how deeply belief shaped behavior. The Olympic Games did not tame human ambition. They gave a sacred frame. Zeus, with all his thunder and judgment, stood as both protector and warning. Under a sky, excellence was possible, but only for those who remembered that even the strongest were still mortal. And in that awareness, balanced delicately between hope and fear, the ancient Olympics found their enduring power. In the stories whispered and repeated across ancient Greece, there was one figure whose shadow seemed to stretch longer than all the others. Heracles was not merely strong. He was strength made visible, suffering given a name, endurance carved into flesh. Wherever people gathered to speak of what the human body could endure, his name surfaced naturally, as though the idea of effort itself needed a face. At Olympia, his presence was felt long before his deeds were fixed in story, woven into the land through belief rather than proof. Heracles was born into contradiction. Half mortal, half divine, he stood forever between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. This in-between nature made him deeply relatable to the Greeks, who saw themselves as fragile beings living under mortal scrutiny. Heracles' power did not spare him from pain. In fact, it seemed to invite it. His life was shaped not by ease, but by tasks so demanding they bordered on impossible. The labors of Heracles were not performed for glory. They were imposed as punishment, acts of atonement meant to cleanse him of guilt. Each labor required not only brute force, but patience, cunning, and a willingness to endure exhaustion without complaint. This mattered. Strength alone was never enough. What elevated Heracles above ordinary warriors was his ability to continue when every instinct urged him to stop. In these stories, effort was sacred. Heracles wrestled beasts, carried unbearable weight, and faced dangers that no one else dared approach. Yet the emphasis was always on the struggle rather than the triumph. The Greeks did not celebrate the moment a monster fell as much as they revered the long path leading to that moment. This reverence for endurance would later echo through the rituals of Olympia. According to tradition, it was Heracles who first measured the sacred grounds of Olympia. He was said to have paced out the length of a stadium using his own feet, setting the distance for the earliest race. Whether this was literal truth or symbolic myth mattered little. What it expressed was more important. That human measurement, human effort, could define sacred space. The body itself became a unit of meaning. In telling this story, the Greeks linked athletic competition directly to heroic suffering. To run, to wrestle, to throw, was to imitate Heracles in miniature. No athlete expected to slay lions or divert rivers, but they could endure pain, test limits, and face fatigue honestly. In doing so, they stepped briefly into heroic tradition. Heracles also embodied restraint. Despite his immense power, his greatest failures came when he lost control. Moments of rage and despair led to irreversible consequences. These episodes were not hidden or softened. They served as warnings. Strength without discipline was dangerous. Endurance without wisdom led to ruin. In this way, Heracles became both ideal and cautionary tale. At Olympia, this duality found expression. Athletes were encouraged to push themselves to the edge of collapse, but not beyond it. The games were not about destruction. They were about mastery of the body, of emotion, of ambition. Heracles' story reminded competitors that greatness was not proven by excess, but by balance. As stories spread from city to city, Heracles became a unifying figure. Different regions told his tale in slightly different ways, but the core remained consistent. He suffered. He endured. He completed what seemed impossible. In a fractured land, this shared narrative offered common ground. When athletes gathered at Olympia, they carried these stories with them, shaping how they understood their own effort. There is something profoundly human in the way myths shape behavior. Belief in Heracles did not require blind faith. It required recognition. The ache in the muscles after training, the fear before competition, the quiet doubt whispered in the dark before sleep. These experiences mirrored the hero's trials in a way that felt intimate and real. Over time, honoring Heracles became intertwined with honoring Zeus. The hero's labors were understood as part of a cosmic order overseen by the king of the gods. Effort aligned with obedience. Endurance became a form of respect. To strive honestly was to accept one's place in a larger story. As the Olympic tradition began to take shape, the figure of Heracles offered a bridge between myth and ritual. He gave meaning to repetition. Why train day after day? Because Heracles endured longer. Why accept pain? Because suffering could purify. Why submit to rules? Because even the strongest needed structure. When athletes stepped onto the dusty ground of Olympia, they were not just competing against one another. They were measuring themselves against a story older than any living person. The outcome mattered, but the effort mattered more. To collapse after a race, lungs burning and legs trembling, was not shameful. It was honorable. It meant the body had been offered fully. As night settled over the valley and fires flickered low, it was easy to imagine Heracles watching from the edge of the light, not judging outcomes, but effort, not counting victories, but persistence. His myth whispered reassurance. Exhaustion was not weakness. Pain was not failure. To continue was everything. In this way, Heracles shaped the earliest spirit of the games, not as spectacle, but as ritual struggle, a reminder that the human body, though mortal and limited, could still echo something divine when pushed with purpose and humility. And so, long before records were kept or champions remembered by name, the shadow of a hero paced the sacred ground, setting not just distances, but expectations. Endure, strive, respect the limits, and in doing so, become worthy of being seen. Long before athletic contests were held for honor alone, they were woven into moments of grief. In the ancient world, death was never distant. It arrived without warning, cutting short lives that had barely begun, leaving behind questions no one could answer. The Greeks did not turn away from this reality. Instead, they sought ways to confront it, to give it structure, to transform loss into something that could be endured. One of the most powerful ways they did this was through competition. Funeral games were not celebrations in the modern sense. They were acts of remembrance. When a great leader, warrior, or hero died, Physical contests were held in their honor. These games were not distractions from sorrow, but expressions of it. To compete was to acknowledge the weight of loss, to feel exhaustion and pain in the body as a reflection of the ache carried in the heart. In stories like the funeral games of Patroclus, described in epic poetry, we see this tradition clearly. Warriors who had fought side by side gathered not to mourn quietly, but to test themselves publicly. Races were run, chariots driven, strength measured. Each contest carried the name of the fallen, binding effort to memory. Victory mattered, but participation mattered more. To step forward was to honor the dead by refusing to let their name fade into silence. These early games followed no universal rules. Each gathering shaped its own contests, its own rewards, its own rituals. What remained constant was the belief that physical struggle could speak where words failed. Grief, like exhaustion, could not always be explained, but it could be shared. Over time, these funeral games revealed something unexpected. Competition did not only honor the dead, it strengthened the living. Rivals stood side by side. Old tensions softened in the presence of shared loss. The body, pushed to its limits, reminded participants of their own mortality, but also of their continued existence. In this way, games became both remembrance and renewal. As generations passed, the connection between death and competition deepened. The Greeks believed that the dead lingered, aware of the actions taken in their name. To honor them properly was a moral obligation. Neglect risked angering restless spirits. Athletic contests, demanding in public, demonstrated commitment more convincingly than words or offerings alone. This belief shaped the tone of early competition. There was seriousness in these games, an absence of frivolity. Laughter was rare. Focus was absolute. The presence of death sharpened attention. Every movement felt meaningful. Every effort counted. Gradually, these practices began to shift. As communities grew and traditions stabilized, funeral games were no longer held only for specific individuals. The ritual itself became valuable. What had once been tied to a single death expanded into a broader act of remembrance, honoring ancestors, heroes, and eventually the gods themselves. This transition did not erase the connection to mortality. It transformed it. Instead of mourning one person, the games came to acknowledge the shared fate of all humans. Every competitor was reminded, subtly but persistently, that strength fades, bodies fail, and time spares no one. To compete was to confront this truth directly. At Olympia, this awareness settled deeply into the atmosphere. The sacred ground had already been shaped by offerings and myth. The addition of athletic contests layered human vulnerability onto divine presence. Sweat fell onto earth already marked by prayer. Fatigue joined silence. Effort joined memory. This combination created a powerful emotional environment. The games were not merely about proving superiority. They were about acknowledging limits. To run until breath burned was to feel the boundary between life and exhaustion. To wrestle until muscles shook was to confront the body's finite nature. These experiences mirrored grief itself. Intense, consuming, yet ultimately survivable. As these rituals became formalized, patterns emerged. Certain events repeated. Certain gestures gained meaning. Awards, at first simple and symbolic, reinforced the idea that honor was intangible. An olive wreath, fragile and temporary, reflected life itself. It withered quickly, but its meaning endured. The shift from funeral games to sacred tradition was gradual, almost imperceptible. No single generation witnessed the transformation fully. It unfolded through repetition, memory, and storytelling. Each time contests were held, the connection to death softened slightly, replaced by reverence for effort itself. Yet the origin remained embedded in the structure, invisible but influential. This origin explains much about the tone of the ancient Olympics. There was respect in the way events were conducted. Ritual preceded competition. Silence often followed. Excessive celebration was discouraged. These were not spectacles designed to distract from mortality. They were rituals designed to face it. For athletes, understanding this context changed the meaning of participation. To enter the games was to accept a role in a tradition shaped by loss. Training took on solemnity. Preparation became a form of meditation. The body was not merely sharpened for victory, but offered as part of a larger remembrance. Even spectators felt this weight. Watching was not passive. It was participatory in its own way. To witness effort was to acknowledge shared vulnerability. Cheers, when they came, were measured. Respect carried more weight than excitement. As night fell over Olympia during these early gatherings, exhaustion settled in alongside reflection. Fires burned low. Stories were told quietly. Names of the honored dead were spoken aloud, ensuring they were not forgotten. In these moments, the boundary between past and present blurred. The living carried the dead forward through effort, through memory, through ritualized struggle. This is the foundation upon which the Olympic Games were built. Not triumph, but remembrance. Not entertainment, but meaning. From funeral rites grew a tradition that transformed grief into discipline, loss into structure, and mortality into something that could be faced together. And those centuries would pass and meanings would shift. This origin left a permanent mark. Beneath the cheers and competition, the ancient Olympics always carried a quiet truth, that a struggle openly, under the eyes of others and the gods, was one of the most honest ways humans knew to honor both the dead and the fragile gift of being alive. At some point, memory settles into record. Stories that once floated freely begin to anchor themselves to dates, names, and places. For the ancient Olympic Games, that moment arrives quietly, without ceremony, without any sense that history is being fixed in place. The year we now call 776 BCE passes like any other for those living through it. Crops are planted, disputes simmer, children are born, elders die. And yet, within this ordinary flow of time, something subtle hardens into permanence. The first recorded Olympic Games are not marked by spectacle. There is no grand procession, no thunderous crowd stretching beyond the horizon. Instead, there is a single event, stark in its simplicity, a foot race. One race, one distance, one winner. The stadium, a straight sprint across packed earth, becomes a measure by which everything else will eventually follow. This simplicity is not a limitation. It is the point. In a world accustomed to excess, boasts of warriors, embellished myths, ever-expanding rivalries, the restraint of this early contest feels almost radical. No elaborate program distracts from the act itself. No variety dilutes attention. The runners stand alone against distance, breath, and time. Victory comes not from complexity, but from clarity. The name of the winner is remembered, Coroebus of Elis. He is said to have been a cook, not a warrior, not a king, not a hero carved from legend. This detail matters deeply. The first Olympic victor does not emerge from nobility or myth, but from ordinary life. His win suggests that excellence is not reserved for the elite. It can rise from anywhere, unexpectedly, quietly. Imagine the moment before the race begins. The air is warm. Dust clings to skin. There is no starting gun, no mechanical signal. Perhaps a shout, perhaps a gesture. The runner's body tenses, heart already racing ahead of legs. Around him, others wait, each carrying their own hopes and fears. There is no guarantee that anyone watching understands the significance of what is about to happen. And then motion. Feet strike the earth. Breath sharpens. Muscles burn almost immediately. The distance is short by modern standards, but in that moment it stretches endlessly. The body argues with the will. Doubt whispers. Pain insists. When the race ends, there is no explosion of celebration. The winner stands, chest heaving, sweat streaking dust across his skin. An olive wreath is placed upon his head, simple and fragile. It will wither soon. But the memory of this moment, though no one present can know it yet, will endure. Why does this moment matter enough to be recorded? Because repetition demands reference. As the games continue, returning again and again to Olympia, people need a way to count time. They begin to measure years not just by seasons or rulers, but by Olympiads. The games become a shared calendar, a rhythm that stretches beyond individual lives. To say something happened in the third year after Coroebus' victory is to tie it to a communal memory. This shift changes everything. History, once local and fragmented, gains a unifying thread. City-states that cannot agree on borders or laws agree, at least on the passage of Olympiads. Even in conflict, they share this temporal anchor. The games begin to weave Greece together, not politically, but culturally. Yet it is important to understand how fragile this beginning is. There is nothing inevitable about the Olympics continuing. A single poor harvest, a prolonged war, a shift in belief could have ended them quietly. The first recorded games survive not because they're spectacular, but because they fit a need already present. They offer structure without domination, meaning without coercion. As the years pass, additional events are added cautiously. Wrestling, throwing, jumping. Each new contest must justify its place. Excess is avoided. The sacred nature of the games demands restraint. Growth is slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. This careful expansion reinforces the seriousness of the occasion. Athletes do not arrive expecting entertainment. They arrive expecting judgment, by peers, by spectators, by the gods. Preparation becomes more disciplined. Training becomes more intentional. The idea of competing casually begins to fade. The recording of victors introduces a new concept, lasting recognition. Names endure beyond lifetimes. A man who wins at Olympia gains a kind of immortality, his identity preserved in lists and memory. This is not wealth. It is something quieter, and in many ways more powerful. But with recognition comes pressure. To be remembered is to be measured. Future athletes compare themselves to those who came before. Expectations grow heavier. Excellence becomes not just admired, but expected. Still, the early games resist spectacle. There are no prizes of gold, no elaborate ceremonies. The olive wreath remains a highest honor, precisely because it is modest. It reminds everyone that glory is temporary, while reputation is lasting. As dusk falls on Olympia after these early contests, the valley returns to stillness. Fires glow softly. Conversations are low and reflective. The day's effort settles into tired muscles. There is no sense of having witnessed a beginning, only the quiet satisfaction of ritual fulfilled. Yet something has shifted. The games have been counted. Time has been marked. Memory has been anchored. From this point forward, the Olympics exist not just as tradition, but as history. Each return to Olympia carries the weight of what came before. Each athlete steps on the ground already shaped by effort, already listening, already remembering. And in this quiet accumulation of meaning without spectacle or announcement, the Olympic Games take their first undeniable step into permanence. To modernize, the sight would have been shocking, even uncomfortable. Men standing openly, bodies uncovered, preparing to compete without armor, without cloth, without anything to hide behind. Yet to the ancient Greeks, this was not scandalous. It was deliberate, purposeful, almost inevitable. The absence of clothing at Olympia was not about display. It was about truth. In a world shaped by ritual and symbolism, nudity carried meaning far beyond the physical. Clothing, after all, conceals. It signals status, wealth, occupation, and origin. To remove it was to remove these markers. On the sacred ground of Olympia, a man did not represent his city through fabric or armor. He represented it through effort alone. Muscle, breath, endurance. These were the only currencies that mattered. There is a quiet vulnerability in standing exposed before others, especially rivals. Every flaw is visible. Every imbalance, every scar, every tremor of uncertainty. Nothing can be hidden. And it is precisely this exposure that transformed competition into something sacred. To compete naked was to declare honesty, not just to others, but to the gods. The Greeks believed the gods saw everything anyway. Zeus watched from the open sky. Apollo observed with cold clarity. There was no point in concealment. To strip away clothing was to align outward appearance with inward truth. What remained was the body as it truly was, unprotected, imperfect, mortal. This practice also reflected a deeper philosophical belief that the human body, properly trained and disciplined, was not shameful. It was a reflection of order, proportion, balance, symmetry. These qualities were admired not merely for beauty, but for what they represented. A body shaped through effort suggested a mind capable of restraint. Physical training was inseparable from moral discipline. Athletes arrived at Olympia after months, sometimes years, of preparation. Diets were strict. Routines were repetitive. Excess was avoided. To stand naked before others was not reckless confidence. It was a culmination of long, quiet labor, a silent statement that nothing had been left undone. There was also equality in this practice. Without clothing, distinction softened. The wealthy stood beside the poor, the famous beside the unknown. Lineage mattered less than readiness. On the starting line, everyone was equally exposed to judgment, by spectators, by competitors, and by the gods. Yet this exposure carried risk. Injury was more likely. The body, unprotected, met dust, impact, strain. Wrestling matches left skin scraped raw. Runners returned with feet blistered and bleeding. There were no modern salves, no advanced treatments. Pain was endured, not minimized. But pain, in this context, was not an enemy. It was a signal, a reminder of limits. The Greeks did not seek pain for its own sake, but they did not flee from it either. Pain marked effort honestly given. It separated those who merely wished to compete from those willing to endure. This willingness carried social weight. An athlete who stepped into competition accepted public scrutiny. Failure unfolded in full view. There was no costume to soften defeat, no armor to disguise weakness. Loss was visible, undeniable, and therefore meaningful. The shame of failure, however, was not absolute. What mattered most was the manner of effort. To quit dishonorably was worse than to lose. To cheat was dangerous. Statues of Zeus stood nearby as reminders of consequences. Dishonesty did not escape notice, not from judges, not from gods. The naked body then became a site of moral testing. It revealed not only physical condition, but character, how one carried exhaustion, how one responded to pain, how one accepted victory or defeat. These qualities lingered in memory longer than times or distances. There is something deeply calming in this clarity. In stripping competition down to its essentials, the ancient Olympics removed many of the distractions that complicate modern life. No elaborate equipment, no technological advantage, just body against body, breath against distance, will against fatigue. Spectators understood this. Watching was an act of attention rather than consumption. Eyes followed movement with seriousness. Silence often fell during critical moments. Applause, when it came, was measured. Respect mattered more than excitement. This atmosphere shaped how athletes perceived themselves. They were not performers. They were participants in a ritual older than any one of them. The absence of clothing reinforced this. It signaled that what mattered was not image, but presence. Even training spaces reflected this belief. Gymnasiums were places of both physical and philosophical education. Young men trained their bodies while absorbing ideas about moderation, honor, and responsibility. Sweat mixed with conversation. Thought and effort intertwined. The term gymnasium itself comes from the word for nakedness. This is not coincidence. It reflects a worldview in which the body was not separate from the mind, but an extension of it. To train one was to train the other. At Olympia, this philosophy reached its highest expression, competing naked under the open sky. Athletes became part of the landscape. Dust clung to skin. Sun marked shoulders. Breath rose visibly in the morning air. The boundary between human and environment softened. There were limits, of course. Women were excluded from watching or competing in these games, their presence tightly controlled. This exclusion carried its own tension and contradiction, reflecting broader social boundaries that the games did not erase. The nudity of male athletes existed within a specific cultural framework, one that celebrated certain bodies while restricting others. Still, within its own context, the practice served its purpose. It reinforced the idea that competition was not about spectacle, but about truth, that the body, when stripped of artifice, could speak honestly about effort and devotion. As the games progressed through the days, the sight of naked athletes became ordinary. What initially startled faded into acceptance. Attention shifted from form to movement, from appearance to outcome. The body became a vessel rather than an object. At the end of competition, when exhaustion settled deep into muscle and bone, there was a sense of completion. The body, having been offered fully, could rest. Wounds would heal. Bruises would fade. What remained was memory. This memory mattered. Long after clothing was put back on, the experience lingered. Athletes returned home carrying not trophies, but stories. Stories of standing exposed before gods and men, of giving everything without concealment. In this way, competing without armor or cloth became one of the most powerful symbols of the ancient Olympics. It reminded everyone present that beneath status, beneath rivalry, beneath ambition, all humans share the same fragile form. Mortal, temporary, capable of astonishing effort, but never invincible. And in acknowledging that truth openly, without hiding from it, the Games achieved something rare, a moment where strength and vulnerability existed side by side, neither denying the other, both held within the quiet authority of sacred ground. Long before an athlete ever stepped onto the sacred ground of Olympia, the real struggle had already begun in quieter places. Training did not start with celebration or applause. It began in isolation, in repetition, in the slow reshaping of the body and the will. The Greeks understood that strength revealed in public was forged in private, and that the discipline required to endure daily preparation mattered as much as any moment of victory. Young men chosen for competition were separated in subtle ways from ordinary life. Their days followed strict rhythms. Meals were simple and carefully measured. Excess was discouraged not out of punishment, but out of respect for balance. The body was treated as something to be shaped patiently, not forced. Overindulgence dulled effort. Hunger sharpened focus. Even sleep was regulated, valued as recovery rather than escape. Training grounds were dusty and open, exposed to sun and wind. There were no elaborate structures designed to soften the environment. Discomfort was considered part of preparation. To grow accustomed to heat, to thirst, to fatigue, was to prepare honestly for competition. The body learned to continue even when comfort was absent. Exercises were repetitive by design, running the same distance again and again, practicing the same throw until movement became instinctive, wrestling not for dominance but for control. This repetition was not seen as boring. It was meditative. Each movement carried the opportunity for refinement. Small adjustments accumulated over time, shaping effort into efficiency. Yet training was never purely physical. The Greeks believed that without discipline of the mind, physical power became dangerous. Athletes were expected to cultivate self-control, humility, and respect. Anger was a liability. Arrogance offended the gods. Trainers emphasized patience as much as strength, reminding athletes that haste often led to injury or dishonor. Isolation played a crucial role. As the Games approached, athletes often withdrew from normal social life. This separation reduced distraction, but it also created space for reflection. Doubts surfaced easily in such quiet. So did fear. Without constant noise, the mind confronted its own limitations. This confrontation was not avoided. It was considered necessary. Oaths sworn before competition demanded honesty not only in action, but in preparation. An athlete who trained half-heartedly risked more than poor performance. He risked disrespect. To appear at Olympia unprepared was to insult the gods and the tradition itself. The expectation of sincerity weighed heavily. Mentorship shaped the training process. Experienced athletes guided younger ones, passing down knowledge gained through pain and failure. This transmission was not formalized through texts or institutions. It lived in conversation, demonstration, and shared exhaustion. Wisdom earned through effort carried authority. The body itself became a teacher. Injuries taught limits. Fatigue taught pacing. Small victories in training built confidence slowly, cautiously. There was no rush toward perfection. Progress unfolded in increments, often invisible to anyone but the athlete himself. Diet reflected the same philosophy. Food was fuel, not indulgence. Meals emphasized simplicity: grains, fruits, vegetables, sometimes meat. Overeating dulled the senses. Fasting, practice in moderation, heightened awareness. The relationship with food mirrored the relationship with effort: intentional, restrained, respectful. As days turned into months, training reshaped identity. Athletes no longer thought of themselves only as sons, farmers, or craftsmen. They became vessels of preparation. Every action, every choice, was weighed against its impact on readiness. This transformation carried both pride and burden. There were moments of exhaustion so deep they bordered on despair. Muscles refused to respond. Breath felt shallow. Progress stalled. In these moments, the stories of heroes like Heracles mattered. Endurance was not measured by constant success, but by the willingness to continue despite doubt. Training also introduced vulnerability. The body, pushed repeatedly, risked breaking. There were no guarantees. An injury weeks before the games could end years of preparation. This uncertainty fostered humility. Athletes learned to accept that control was limited. Effort did not guarantee outcome. Yet this vulnerability strengthened devotion. The more an athlete invested, the more meaningful the attempt became. Even failure gained dignity when preceded by honest preparation. This belief softened the fear of loss, allowing athletes to focus on effort rather than result. As the games drew closer, anticipation intensified. Training sessions sharpened. Movements grew precise. Rest became as important as exertion. The body, once strained, began to feel tuned rather than exhausted. This transition was subtle, almost imperceptible, but deeply reassuring. The final days before departure carried a peculiar stillness. Training eased. The body was allowed to recover. The mind replayed movements, imagined outcomes. Anxiety mingled with excitement. Sleep became light, dreams vivid. Leaving for Olympia marked a psychological shift. The training phase ended. The offering phase began. Everything built in private would now be revealed in public. There was no room for adjustment, no opportunity to hide. Yet despite the weight of expectation, many athletes felt a strange calm upon arrival. The discipline of preparation had created inner stability. Whatever the outcome, they knew they had honored the process. This knowledge carried quiet strength. In this way, training bound body and soul together. Effort shaped character. Discipline fostered humility. Endurance cultivated respect for limits. The athlete arrived at Olympia not as a raw contender, but as a participant in a larger ritual. When competition finally began, the body moved almost automatically. Training took over. The mind, freed from calculation, followed instinct shaped by repetition. In these moments, preparation justified itself. Every early morning, every restrained meal, every solitary run found its purpose. This was the unseen heart of the Olympic Games. Not the contest itself, but the long, patient devotion that made the contest meaningful. Without training, victory was empty. Without discipline, strength was dangerous. Together, they formed a quiet covenant between effort and honor, binding the athlete to tradition long before his name could ever be remembered. In a land accustomed to conflict, the idea of stopping war, even briefly, felt almost unnatural. For most of ancient Greece, violence was not a disruption of normal life. It was woven into it. Borders shifted constantly. Alliances fractured without warning. Young men trained with a quiet expectation that they would one day be called to fight. And yet, amid this constant readiness for bloodshed, there existed a fragile agreement so powerful that even enemies hesitated to break it. This agreement was the Olympic truce. Known as the Ekakeria, the truce was not born from idealism or naive hope. It emerged from necessity. Olympia could not function as a sacred gathering place if armies marched through it. Athletes could not travel safely if roads were blocked by spears and shields. The games required movement, and movement required restraint. Before each Olympiad, heralds were sent out from Elis, the region that governed Olympia. They traveled across the Greek world, passing through hostile territories, announcing a simple but extraordinary declaration. For the duration of the games, all warfare was to cease. Weapons were to be laid down. Armies were to halt their advance. Travelers were to be allowed safe passage to and from Olympia. This was not a plea. It was a command backed by religious authority. To violate the truce was not merely a political act. It was a sacrilege. It meant offending Zeus himself, whose games these were believed to be. The consequences were not abstract. Cities that ignored the truce faced fines, exclusion from future games, and, perhaps most feared of all, the stain of divine disfavor. In a culture where belief shaped reality, this threat carried real weight. The truce did not erase hostility. Old grudges remained. Distrust lingered, but it suspended action. It forced enemies to coexist in proximity without violence. Soldiers became spectators. Warriors became athletes. For a brief time, strength was redirected rather than suppressed. This redirection mattered deeply. It acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Conflict was inevitable, but it could be shaped. The games did not deny aggression. They transformed it. Rivalry was not abolished, but ritualized. Instead of killing, men raced. Instead of sieging cities, they wrestled in dust beneath the open sky. The journey to Olympia during the truce was itself part of the experience. Athletes and spectators traveled together along roads that, at other times, would have been dangerous. Encounters that might have ended in violence instead passed in tense silence or cautious conversation. People recognized one another as rivals, sometimes even enemies, but also as participants in a shared ritual. This uneasy coexistence created a powerful psychological shift. It reminded travelers that identity extended beyond the battlefield. A man was not only a soldier of Sparta or a citizen of Athens. He was also a Greek, shaped by shared myths, shared gods, and now shared restraint. The truce did not guarantee safety in the modern sense. Bandits still existed. Accidents still happened, but it created a moral boundary. Violence during this time felt wrong in a way it did not elsewhere. The land itself seemed to demand peace, if only temporarily. At Olympia, the effect of the truce was palpable. The presence of rival cities did not erupt into chaos. Instead, tension simmered beneath ritual. The knowledge that violence was forbidden sharpened attention. Words were chosen carefully. Gestures were restrained. The effort to maintain peace was visible and therefore meaningful. This restraint extended into competition itself. Rules were enforced strictly. Judges swore oaths to fairness. Cheating was not merely unsportsmanlike. It was a violation of sacred trust. The truce created an expectation that honor would prevail, even when rivalry burned hottest. The psychological impact of the truce lingered beyond the games. Those who returned home carried a memory of standing near enemies without fighting them. This did not end wars, but it complicated them. It introduced the idea that peace, even temporary peace, was possible. That restraint was not weakness. For some, this realization was unsettling. War had clear rules, clear enemies. Peace demanded patience, self-control, and uncertainty. It required trust in tradition rather than immediate force. The truce asked much of those accustomed to resolving disputes through violence. Yet its endurance speaks to its power. Generation after generation, cities honored it, not because it was easy, but because it worked. It allowed the games to continue. It preserved Olympia as sacred ground. It offered a rhythm of conflict and restraint that mirrored the broader human struggle between impulse and control. The truce also reinforced the authority of the games themselves. By halting wars, the Olympics asserted cultural dominance over political ambition. Kings and generals deferred to ritual. This inversion of power was remarkable. For a few weeks, athletic competition mattered more than conquest. As the days of competition unfolded, the presence of peace became almost invisible, precisely because it held. Silence replaced the clash of arms. Dust replaced blood. Cheers replaced battle cries. This absence of violence did not weaken the experience. It deepened it. When the games ended, the truce lifted. Armies resumed their march. Conflicts reignited. The world returned to its familiar state of tension. But something remained changed. The memory of peace lingered, fragile but real. This rhythm, war, pause, war again, became part of the Greek understanding of balance. The Olympics did not promise a world without conflict. They offered something quieter and perhaps more realistic, moments of restraint that gave meaning to strength. As athletes departed Olympia, passing again along the roads they had traveled in safety, they carried more than fatigue and pride. They carried proof that violence could be paused, that rivalry could be contained, that the gods demanded not only strength, but control. In this way, the Olympic truce became one of the most profound legacies of the ancient games, not because it ended wars, but because it acknowledged humanity's capacity for both destruction and discipline. It stood as a reminder that even in a world shaped by conflict, There were moments when silence was stronger than steel. And beneath the open sky of Olympia, watched by Zeus and remembered by history, that silence mattered. In the midst of dust, sweat, and thunderous effort, there was an absence that shaped the ancient Olympic Games as much as any presence. Women were not there, not on the track, not in the wrestling grounds, not among the crowds pressed close to the sacred space. Their exclusion was absolute, deliberate, and deeply revealing of the world in which the Games were born. For married women, even watching the Olympic Games was forbidden. The penalty for defiance, according to tradition, was severe, death by being thrown from a cliff. Whether this punishment was ever carried out mattered less than the fact that it existed at all. It served as a warning, a boundary drawn sharply around sacred male space. Olympia was imagined as a place of exposed bodies, ritual vulnerability, and competition under the gaze of male gods. Within this vision, women were seen as disruptive, dangerous, or simply out of place. And yet, their absence was never complete. Women were everywhere in the background of the Games. They were mothers who raised future athletes, shaping their bodies and habits long before trainers ever intervened. They prepared food, managed households, and maintained stability that allowed men to leave for weeks of training and travel. Without this invisible labor, the Games could not have functioned. The contradiction runs deeper. While women were barred from participation, goddesses were not. Hera, queen of the gods, held a powerful presence at Olympia. Her temple stood prominently, older even than the great temple of Zeus. This alone reveals a tension at the heart of the tradition. The feminine divine was honored, while human women were excluded. This tension produced a quiet countercurrent to the Olympic Games. The Heraean Games, held in honor of Hera, these competitions allowed young, unmarried women to race at Olympia. Their track was slightly shorter than the men's stadium, their clothing a short tunic rather than full nudity. The events were fewer, the attention smaller, but the symbolism was undeniable. Women could compete. They could be honored, just not within the same ritual framework. These races were not side attractions. They were sacred in their own right. Victors received olive wreaths and could dedicate statues or offerings to Hera. For the women who ran, the experience carried meaning beyond sport. It marked transitions, youth to adulthood, preparation for marriage, recognition within the community. Still, the separation remained firm. The men's games and the women's games did not overlap. They did not share space or time. This division reflected broader Greek beliefs about order and balance. Men and women occupied different spheres, each with its own expectations, responsibilities, and restrictions. The ancient Greeks often framed the separation as natural rather than oppressive. Physical competition among men was tied to warfare, citizenship, and public life. Women, excluded from these realms, were seen as unsuited to such contests. Strength in women was acknowledged, but rarely celebrated publicly. Endurance was expected quietly, within the home, in childbirth, in loss, in labor unseen. This silence is perhaps the most striking aspect of women's relationship to the Olympics. While men's victories were announced, recorded, and remembered, women's contributions faded into anonymity. Their strength left fewer marks on stone and story, but it was no less real. There are rare moments when women break through the silence. Caniska of Sparta, for example, became the first woman to be recorded as an Olympic victor, not by competing directly, but by owning the horses that won a chariot race. Her victory exposed a loophole in the rules and unsettled assumptions about gender and honor. She did not drive the chariot herself, yet her name was inscribed among victors. The system allowed it, even if it did not welcome it. Such moments were exceptions, not transformations. They did not dismantle exclusion, but they revealed its fragility. They showed that the boundaries of tradition were constructed, maintained through belief rather than inevitability. For spectators and participants alike, the absence of women shaped the emotional tone of the Games. Olympia became a space of exaggerated masculinity. Bodies pushed to extremes. Pain endured publicly. Honor won or lost in moments of exposure. The lack of women reinforced the idea that this was a proving ground for male identity. Yet even here, the feminine was not entirely absent. Songs, prayers, and offerings often invoked female deities. Mothers waited at home, anxious and proud. Sisters and daughters imagined outcomes they were forbidden to witness. The games rippled outward, touching lives far beyond the sacred boundary. From a modern perspective, this exclusion can feel jarring, even unsettling. But to understand the ancient Olympics fully, it must be faced rather than softened. The games reflected the values of their time, including their limitations. They elevated certain forms of strength while ignoring others. They celebrated visibility while relying on invisibility. There is a quiet poignancy in imagining the women who lived near Olympia during the games, hearing distant cheers, watching strangers pass through their lands, knowing something important was happening, yet being denied entry. Their experience added a layer of emotional depth often missing from triumphant narratives. And still, endurance persisted. Women endured exclusion as they endured so much else. They found meaning in parallel rituals, in private strength, in roles unacknowledged by stone or song. Their lives unfolded alongside the Olympics, intertwined but unrecognized. In this way, the absence of women becomes part of the story, not a footnote but a shaping force. It reminds us that traditions are never complete reflections of humanity. They are selections, emphases, choices made within specific cultural frameworks. The ancient Olympic Games offer a vision of excellence, but it was a narrow one. Understanding that limitation does not diminish the Games. It deepens them. It reveals the complexity of a world that sought order and meaning while carrying contradictions it could not resolve. As the dust settled after each Olympiad, and athletes returned home bearing wreaths and memories, women remained behind, holding continuity together. Their strength did not echo through stadiums, but it endured through generations. And in the quiet spaces beyond Olympia's sacred ground, life went on, shaped by effort, resilience, and endurance no less demanding than any race, even if history chose not to record it. There was no gold at the end of the race. No silver, no bronze, no chest of coins waiting to be claimed. When an athlete crossed the finish line at Olympia, exhausted and shaking, the reward placed upon his head was almost painfully simple. A wreath woven from the leaves of a wild olive tree. It weighed almost nothing. It would dry, crumble, and fade within days. And yet, to the ancient Greeks, this fragile crown carried more weight than treasure. The olive tree itself was sacred. It was believed it had been planted by Heracles, cut from a wild olive growing near the sanctuary of Zeus. Its branches were not harvested casually. Only one tree, known as the Calistephanos, was used to create wreaths for victors. A young boy, whose parents were both alive, cut the branches with a golden knife. Even this act was ritualized, wrapped in symbolism and care. Nothing about victory was rushed or careless. The simplicity of the prize was deliberate. Wealth could corrupt. Gold could distract. The games were not meant to enrich individuals financially. They were meant to reveal excellence. The olive wreath represented something purer, recognition without possession, honor without accumulation, a reminder that the highest achievements could not be owned, only witnessed. To receive the wreath was to be seen. Fully, publicly, permanently. The victor's name was announced, remembered, recorded. Poets would later compose verses in his honor. Sculptors might carve his likeness. His city would celebrate him not for what he gained, but for what he demonstrated. When he returned home, the celebration intensified. Victors often entered their city through a breach in the walls, a symbolic gesture suggesting that the city no longer needed defenses. It had men of excellence instead. They might be granted free meals for life, front row seats at festivals, or public praise that elevated their status beyond ordinary citizens. Yet none of these honors were given at Olympia itself. The sacred ground remained restrained, almost austere. This separation mattered. Olympia did not concern itself with personal reward. It concerned itself with judgment. The moment of victory was brief, quiet, and ritualized. Only later did its consequences ripple outward. The absence of material reward shaped the psychology of competition. Athletes trained not for wealth, but for recognition. Their motivation came from a desire to be remembered, to be known as someone who had met the standard of excellence set by tradition and the gods. This desire carried both inspiration and burden. To win was to step into a story larger than oneself. To lose was to accept anonymity. There were no consolation prizes, no tiers of recognition, only one victor. This starkness sharpened effort. It made participation itself an act of courage. The olive wreath also carried moral weight. It reminded the victor that glory was temporary. The leaves would wither. Applause would fade. What remained was reputation, shaped not only by victory, but by conduct. An athlete who behaved arrogantly or dishonestly could tarnish his honor quickly. Memory was fragile, and so was forgiveness. This focus on intangible reward reflected a broader Greek value, the pursuit of arete, excellence in its full essence. Arete was not just skill. It was virtue, balance, and purpose combined. An Olympic victory was one expression of arete, but not its total measure. How one lived afterward mattered just as much. There is something deeply calming in this approach to reward. It slows the rhythm of desire. It shifts attention from accumulation to experience. In a culture where survival was uncertain, this restraint offered stability. It suggested that meaning did not depend on possessions, but on alignment with ideals. The audience at Olympia understood this. They did not watch to see wealth distributed. They watched to witness effort transformed into recognition. The moment the wreath was placed mattered because it marked agreement. This person had met the standard. This effort had been sufficient. The silence that often followed the awarding of the wreath is telling. It was not the silence of disappointment, but of absorption. Spectators took in what they had seen. Athletes reflected on what they had given. The ritual closed not with noise, but with acknowledgement. Over time, this tradition influenced Greek thought beyond the games. Philosophers wrote about honor and virtue. Poets celebrated restraint. The idea that the highest achievements required no material reward seeped into broader cultural values. It shaped how excellence was discussed, even if not always practiced. Of course, reality was complicated. Outside Olympia, money mattered. Power mattered. Status mattered. Victors enjoyed privileges that improved their lives materially. But these benefits were secondary, consequences rather than goals. The wreath remained a core symbol, reminding everyone where true value was believed to lie. There is a subtle psychological effect in striving for something that cannot be held. It demands presence. One cannot hoard honor. One must earn it anew each time, in each context. This impermanence kept pride in check, at least in theory. It reminded athletes that no victory made them untouchable. The olive wreath also linked victors to the land itself. Olive trees grow slowly. They endure drought, heat, neglect. Their fruit appears only after years of patience. To be crowned with olive leaves was to be associated with endurance and time. It suggested that excellence, like the tree, required long growth and careful tending. As generations passed, lists of victors grew longer. Names accumulated. Some were remembered more vividly than others. But each name represented a moment when effort had been judged worthy. The absence of material reward made these lists feel purer, less entangled with economic ambition. For athletes preparing to compete, the knowledge of the prize shaped expectations. They did not imagine wealth waiting at the finish line. They imagined the weightless touch of leaves, the moment of being seen, the possibility of belonging briefly to something enduring. Even failure gained dignity in this context. As the Olympic Games grew in reputation and scale, something inevitable followed them into the sacred valley, human imperfection. Where honor was prized, temptation appeared. Where recognition endured beyond death, the desire to secure it by any means quietly took root. The Games had been born from ritual and restraint, but they were never immune to the complexities of human nature. Crowds began to swell at Olympia. What had once been a solemn gathering of the devoted slowly transformed into an event that drew spectators from across the Greek world. With them came noise, excitement, and expectation. The air grew thicker with anticipation. Victories were no longer witnessed by a small circle of peers. They were seen by thousands. To win now meant fame that could echo across generations. And where fame grows, pressure follows closely behind. Athletes arrived not only with trained bodies, but with hopes shaped by their cities. City-states invested pride in their competitors. A victor's success reflected collective strength. A loss could feel like communal failure. This weight altered the emotional landscape of competition. Effort was no longer purely personal. It became political, symbolic, and sometimes desperate. In this environment, the line between determination and dishonesty blurred for some. Cheating appeared in subtle forms at first. Small rule violations, quiet bribes, agreements whispered in shadow. These acts were rarely framed by their perpetrators as corruption. They were justified as necessity, as strategy, as survival in an increasingly competitive world. Judges, too, faced temptation. Their authority was immense. A single decision could determine legacy. While oaths were sworn before Zeus, human resolve sometimes wavered. Pressure from powerful cities, personal ambition, or fear of reprisal could influence judgment. The sacred nature of the games did not erase these vulnerabilities. It merely made their consequences more severe. The Greeks responded not by denying the problem, but by confronting it openly. At Olympia, statues known as Zanes were erected, bronze figures of Zeus funded by fines imposed on athletes who cheated. These statues stood along the path leading to the stadium, unavoidable and accusatory, inscribed with the names of offenders and the nature of their crimes. They served as permanent warnings. To pass the Zanes on the way to competition was to be reminded of the cost of dishonor. These were not hidden punishments. They were public, enduring, and humiliating. A cheat's name was preserved not as a victor, but as a cautionary tale. In a culture obsessed with memory, this was a powerful deterrent. The presence of these statues reveals something important about the ancient games. Corruption was not seen as an anomaly. It was expected, anticipated, and guarded against. The Greeks understood themselves too well to imagine perfection. Instead, they built systems that acknowledged weakness while reinforcing ideals. For spectators, the growing crowds introduced new dynamics. Excitement sometimes spilled into unruliness. Cheering turned partisan. Insults were shouted. Tension flared between rival city-states seated near one another. The games remained sacred, but they were no longer quiet. This shift changed how athletes experienced competition. Focus became harder to maintain. Distraction lurked everywhere. The roar of approval or disapproval could influence confidence, amplify doubt, or inflame pride. Mental discipline became as crucial as physical readiness. And yet, within this chaos, the core ritual endured. Despite temptations, despite noise, most athletes competed honestly. The very existence of corruption reinforced the value of integrity. Each fair contest felt like a small victory against entropy. Cheating, when discovered, carried consequences beyond fines. Offenders faced exclusion from future games, disgrace at home, and the knowledge that their attempt to seize honor had achieved the opposite. Their story became a lesson told to future athletes, woven into the tradition as a warning. There's a quiet, psychological truth here. When excellence becomes visible and rare, shortcuts appear alluring. The Greeks did not solve this problem completely, but they understood its roots. They recognized that the desire to be remembered could distort values if left unchecked. Interestingly, the increase in corruption did not diminish reverence for the games. If anything, it intensified efforts to protect them. Rules were clarified, procedures refined, judges held to stricter standards. The sacred boundary of Olympia was defended not by denial, but by vigilance. This tension between ideal and reality gave the Olympics a deeper resonance. They were not utopian fantasies. They were human institutions striving toward higher values while carrying human flaws. This made them believable, relatable, and enduring. Spectators, too, learned to navigate this complexity. Watching was no longer passive admiration. It involved judgment. Debates erupted about fairness, merit, and conduct. Stories of controversial victories circulated long after the games ended. Memory became layered, contested, alive. As night fell after days of competition, conversations lingered around fires. Names of victors were spoken alongside whispers of suspicion. Not every victory felt clean. Not every loss felt deserved. Yet even this uncertainty had meaning. It reflected the reality of human systems, where truth is pursued but never perfectly captured. The presence of corruption also reinforced the moral authority of Zeus. When cheaters were punished, It was framed not merely as human justice, but as divine order restored. Zeus's role as guardian of oaths gained renewed importance. The gods remained central arbiters, even when humans faltered. Over time, the stories of cheating and punishment became as much a part of Olympic lore as tales of heroic effort. They were told not to diminish the games, but to remind listeners of the cost of forgetting why the games existed in the first place. As modern listeners drift through this chapter of the story, there's a strange comfort in its honesty. The ancient Olympics were not pure. They were not free from ambition's darker impulses, and yet they endured precisely because they acknowledged this truth. In recognizing corruption, the Greeks reaffirmed their commitment to honor. In punishing dishonesty, they protected meaning. In allowing crowds and noise, they accepted growth. The games evolved not by resisting human nature, but by shaping it. And so, amid dust and cheers, beneath statues that warned as much as they watched, the Olympics continued. Imperfect, contested, human, held together not by the absence of flaws, but by a shared insistence that excellence, though fragile, was still worth striving for, even when temptation whispered otherwise. There came a time when the Olympic Games no longer felt like a fragile tradition held together by careful restraint. They had survived centuries. They had weathered wars, political shifts, and human weakness. And now, they stood at their height, confident, expansive, and deeply woven into the fabric of Greek life. Olympia no longer waited quietly for visitors. It expected them. By this point, the games unfolded with a rhythm everyone understood. The journey to Olympia had become almost ceremonial in itself. Roads filled with travelers weeks in advance. Athletes arrived lean and focused, accompanied by trainers, former competitors, and admirers. Spectators followed in great numbers, bringing food, stories, and the restless energy of anticipation. Tents and temporary shelters spread across the surrounding land, transforming the once silent valley into a living, breathing city. The program of events had grown richer and more demanding. Races of varying lengths tested speed and endurance. Wrestling, boxing, and the brutal pancration pushed bodies toward collapse. The pentathlon combined multiple disciplines, rewarding balance over specialization. Chariot races thundered beyond the sacred grove, shaking the ground and drawing gasps from onlookers. Each event added texture to games, expanding the definition of excellence. And yet, despite this growth, the heart of the Olympics remained unchanged. Effort was still sacred. Rules were still enforced with seriousness. Oaths were still sworn before Zeus. The scale had increased, but the ritual core held firm, anchoring the spectacle to meaning. The crowds themselves became part of the experience. Thousands gathered in close proximity, sitting under the open sky, enduring heat and dust without complaint. Comfort was secondary to presence. To witness the games was an act of devotion as much as entertainment. Spectators did not expect convenience. They expected significance. With these crowds came stories. Victors were no longer known only by name, but by reputation. Tales of past triumphs circulated widely. A runner's previous victories became legend. A wrestler's signature hold was anticipated. The games developed a memory, one that extended beyond individual Olympiads and shaped expectations. This accumulation of memory created continuity. Each Olympiad felt connected to the last, not as repetition, but as progression. Athletes competed not just against those beside them, but against history itself. Records, though informal, mattered. Comparisons were drawn. Greatness was debated. At the height of the games, Olympia felt like the center of the Greek world, not politically, but culturally. City-states that could not agree on laws or borders agreed on this. Olympia mattered. The games offered a shared reference point, a rare moment when identity expanded beyond local loyalty. This cultural gravity influenced art, philosophy, and education. Sculptors studied athletes' bodies, capturing tension and release in stone and bronze. Poets composed verses celebrating victory and effort. Philosophers reflected on discipline, competition, and the pursuit of excellence. The Olympics became a lens through which Greek values were examined and expressed. Even the atmosphere of the valley changed. Where once silence dominated, now a low, constant murmur filled the air. Conversations overlapped. Merchants called out offerings. Musicians played between events. Life unfolded densely, vibrantly, yet always within an invisible boundary of reverence. Sacred space was not diminished by activity. It was animated by it. Athletes felt this shift keenly. Competing at the peak of the games meant performing before an audience that understood the stakes. Expectations were high. Failure felt heavier. Victory felt sharper. The pressure performed could elevate or unravel even the most disciplined competitor. Training adapted accordingly. Preparation became more specialized. Techniques were refined. Knowledge accumulated across generations. Athletes learned not only from their own experience, but from those who came before. Excellence became both inherited and earned. Yet even at this peak, there was an undercurrent of fragility. Growth introduced strain. Managing crowds tested resources. Maintaining order required constant vigilance. The balance between sacred ritual and public spectacle grew more delicate. Some observers worried quietly that the games were becoming too grand. That noise threatened reflection. That fame risked overshadowing devotion. These concerns did not halt the games, but they lingered, shaping discussions and reforms. Still, for most, this was a golden age. Olympia thrived. The games fulfilled their promise as a space where strength, discipline, and honor converged. For a few days every 4 years, the Greek world felt whole. As the final events concluded and victors were crowned, a sense of completion settled over the valley. Exhaustion mingled with satisfaction. The crowd slowly dispersed. Tents came down. Paths cleared. Olympia began to empty, returning gradually to stillness. But something remained behind, invisible yet tangible. The weight of what had been achieved. At their peak, the Olympic Games demonstrated what humans could create when rivalry was given structure, when ambition was shaped by ritual, and when excellence was pursued not for wealth, but for meaning. This peak was not an end point. It was a moment balanced on a ridge between endurance and decline. The very forces that elevated the Games, growth, fame, expansion, would eventually test them. But for now, in this moment of fullness, the Olympics stood as one of the ancient world's most remarkable achievements. They had become more than contests. They were a mirror held up to a civilization at its height, reflecting both its ideals and its vulnerabilities. And in that reflection, beneath the open sky of Olympia, the ancient Greeks saw something worth returning to again and again, even as time continued its quiet, unstoppable march forward. The first hints of change came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but they carried the weight of centuries. The Olympic Games, once the sacred preserve of Greek city-states and their citizens, began to encounter forces that would reshape them in ways both subtle and profound. Rome, rising steadily in power and influence, was one of these forces, and its presence would transform Olympia from a sanctuary of spiritual and physical devotion into a stage for spectacle. Initially, the Romans approached the Games with curiosity rather than conquest. They admired Greek culture, mythology, and philosophy, and they respected the prestige of Olympia. For Rome, the Games represented more than competition. They were a demonstration of power and sophistication. Participation was an opportunity to claim association with Greece's celebrated traditions, and the Roman elite began to send competitors, spectators, and financial support. Their arrival changed the rhythm of the Games. Rome's approach to sport and spectacle differed fundamentally from that of the Greeks. Whereas the Greeks framed competition as ritual, moral testing, and devotion to gods, the Romans emphasized display, entertainment, and social hierarchy. Where Greek athletes competed nude to reveal discipline and honesty, Roman expectations often prioritized spectacle and grandeur over sacred formality. Crowds grew larger, more boisterous, and increasingly focused on excitement rather than reflection. This influx of Roman influence did not immediately destroy the Games, but it subtly altered their character. Chariot races became more elaborate, demanding more horses, faster speeds, and more daring maneuvers. The pentathlon and wrestling contests evolved to emphasize dramatic displays of strength. Spectators expected visible drama. They wanted to be thrilled, entertained, and awed. The sacred austerity of earlier Olympiads slowly gave way to an environment shaped by crowd reaction and public fascination. Athletes, too, were affected. Roman competitors often trained not only for discipline, but for reputation, fame, and patronage. City-state pride remained important, but the desire to impress influential Romans, those who could grant favors, wealth, or political leverage, introduced new pressures. The moral weight of effort and virtue remained, but it now shared space with ambition driven by human reward. Competition was still sacred, but it was increasingly entangled with human desire. These changes rippled through the social fabric of Olympia. Spectators, who had once sat quietly in contemplation or respectful admiration, now arrived with heightened expectation. Merchants and entertainers followed the crowds, transforming the surrounding valley into a bustling hub of activity. Markets flourished. Food and wares were exchanged in record volume. Noise became part of the atmosphere, a constant companion to dust, movement, and exertion. Olympia was no longer only a place of ritual. It had become a center of cultural convergence, a site where spectacle and devotion coexisted uneasily. Roman influence also introduced structural changes. Temporary seating expanded, viewing areas were improved, and accommodations for dignitaries grew more elaborate. While these adjustments facilitated participation, they also signaled a shift in priorities. Comfort and display began to compete with sacred tradition. Space once reserved for ritual was now encroached upon by convenience and status. The spiritual dimension of the games did not vanish immediately. Altars still stood. Sacrifices continued. Oaths were sworn before Zeus. Yet the Roman emphasis on public recognition, money, and fame slowly diluted the purity of devotion. Effort became a public performance as much as a personal offering. Excellence was still pursued, but it was measured by applause and reputation as much as by ritual judgment. This transformation created tension. Greek athletes and spectators accustomed to restraint and sacred discipline occasionally bristled at the changes. They noticed a difference in Roman training methods, the enthusiasm for dramatic feats, and the increasing emphasis on wealth and status. Some lamented the intrusion of spectacle, fearing that the essence of Olympia, the moral and spiritual rigor, might be lost beneath excitement and display. Yet the Greeks were also pragmatic. They adapted. Integration with Roman practices allowed the games to continue and even flourish under new patronage. Funding from Rome improved infrastructure and resources. Wider participation expanded influence. Olympia survived where it might have faltered, albeit in a transformed form. The games became resilient, not because they remained unchanged, but because they accommodated evolution. This period also altered how victory was perceived. Under Greek tradition, winning was a moral, spiritual, and civic achievement. Under Roman influence, it increasingly included social capital. Victors gained not only honor but political leverage and wealth indirectly tied to spectacle. Olive wreaths remained symbolic, but recognition became entangled with human ambition. The pursuit of excellence, once aligned primarily with divine favor, now danced with worldly reward. The arrival of Rome also had long-term cultural consequences. Greek ideals of errate discipline and sacred effort were disseminated more widely through Roman participation. Roman poets, historians, and philosophers recorded the games, ensuring their preservation for posterity. At the same time, these accounts sometimes emphasized grandeur and spectacle over ritual, subtly shifting the lens through which future generations would understand Olympia. Despite these transformations, the games retained their core appeal. Athletes continued to train rigorously, adhering to discipline and moral expectation. Competitions remained physically demanding, psychologically intense, and spiritually resonant. The presence of Romans enhanced the sense of prestige, elevating victory to a level that carried significance beyond city-state pride. Olympia became not just a local sanctuary, but a hub of Mediterranean identity. However, the blending of Greek ritual with Roman spectacle introduced contradictions. Sacred effort and public performance coexisted uneasily. Tradition and innovation competed for attention. Moral evaluation and human applause sometimes diverged. This duality created an undercurrent of tension, a subtle reminder that even revered institutions are vulnerable to external influence. Athletes navigating this world had to reconcile multiple expectations. They competed not only to honor the gods, but to satisfy spectators, patrons, and civic pride. Physical excellence remained essential, but strategy, showmanship, and social awareness became increasingly relevant. Success required mastery of more than the body alone. It demanded psychological acuity, public presence, and understanding of complex social dynamics. Spectators, too, participated differently. Whereas the earliest audiences witnessed ritual and effort quietly, Roman influence encouraged engagement, commentary, and even argument. Applause, debate, and rivalry among spectators enhanced the communal aspect of the games. Over time, a profound shift swept across the Mediterranean world. Subtle at first, but irreversible in its consequences. The Olympic Games, once anchored firmly in the worship of the Greek gods, began to encounter a force that could not be accommodated, negotiated, or integrated: the rise of Christianity. This transformation did not arrive as a single event or decree, but as a gradual cultural and spiritual realignment that slowly eroded the foundations of Olympia, leaving its sacred traditions vulnerable to reinterpretation and eventual decline. The early Christians viewed the pantheon of Greek gods as idolatry. Worship at Olympia, with its altars, statues, and sacrifices, was seen not as benign ritual, but as moral and spiritual error. Temples and rituals that had endured for centuries now carried the weight of judgment. Acts once considered sacred, from athletic odes to offerings of animal sacrifice, were increasingly understood as morally incompatible with the new faith. To those who embraced Christianity, the games were more than a public spectacle. They were a symbol of a world from which they were being called to separate themselves. This moral dissonance created tension on multiple levels. For centuries, Olympia had thrived as a unifying space for Greek city-states, bringing together rivals under shared ritual and divine oversight. With the spread of Christianity, participation in the games increasingly conflicted with evolving religious identities. Communities once eager to send competitors and spectators began to question propriety of attending a festival devoted to gods no longer honored. Parents hesitated to allow their sons to train and compete in arenas where pagan worship remained central. Even the moral authority of Zeus, once unassailable, faced profound skepticism. The philosophical shift accompanying Christianity also played a role. While Greek thought had long prized a rate, the pursuit of excellence, its framework was intertwined with human and divine honor. Moral virtue was inseparable from physical prowess, social standing, and adherence to ritual. Christianity reoriented this value system, emphasizing spiritual virtue over worldly or bodily achievement. Effort and discipline were no longer morally validated simply by excellence in competition. They were meaningful only insofar as they served God or neighbor. Athletic contests, no matter how disciplined or honorable, began to feel morally extraneous in this new paradigm. The practical consequences for Olympia were subtle at first, then unmistakable. Funding that had once flowed from city-states and wealthy patrons declined. Cities grappling with the moral expectations of their Christian populations began to withdraw support. Attendance dropped as fewer spectators felt comfortable endorsing or participating in pagan ritual. The economic and social networks that had sustained the games for centuries began to unravel. Olympia's isolation, once a safeguard, now became a liability. Without broad societal support, even its sacred ground could not maintain vitality. Political changes reinforced these pressures. As the Roman Empire increasingly embraced Christianity, laws and decrees began to limit public participation in pagan festivals. By the late 4th century CE, the imperial mandate was explicit. Traditional religious festivals, including the Olympics, were to be curtailed or abolished. Where enforcement was gradual, participation waned quietly. Where it was direct, ceremonies were forcibly terminated. Olympia, once a bustling hub of Mediterranean unity and ritual, faced legal as well as moral exclusion. Yet the transformation was not simply a matter of law or ideology. It was also psychological and cultural. For generations, Greeks had associated physical excellence with divine favor, believing that Zeus rewarded effort and morality. Christian thought reframed the relationship between effort and value. Mortal accomplishment alone could no longer claim eternal significance. Victory at Olympia, which had once carried moral, civic, and even divine weight, became spiritually hollow in the eyes of the faithful. Athletes trained and competed less for honor and more cautiously, aware that the gods they honor were now viewed as false or dangerous. The emotional energy that had sustained centuries of competition slowly dissipated. This cultural shift also transformed memory and storytelling. Tales of heroic effort, once recounted at festivals and in the home, began to lose their cultural resonance. The narrative of mortal striving intertwined with divine oversight no longer fit the prevailing worldview. Older myths were still remembered in art and text, but they became curiosities of a past age rather than living models for behavior. With each generation, the connection between Olympia and its foundational mythology weakened. Christian leaders sometimes attempted to redirect attention toward moral and spiritual competitions of a different kind. Parallels were drawn between athletic discipline and spiritual struggle. Resisting temptation, enduring suffering, and persevering in faith were framed as higher forms of excellence. These interpretations, however, could not replace the visceral, public, communal experience of the games. The rhythm of footfalls, the strain of muscles, the thrill of measured competition under open sky. These embodied experiences had no spiritual analog in Christian teaching, and their absence left a palpable void. By the early 5th century CE, the decline was unmistakable. Attendance was low. Participation was sporadic. Infrastructure fell into disrepair. The sacred grove, once alive with ritual preparation, echoed only faintly with memory. Temples deteriorated. Altars were abandoned. The valley, which had once been vibrant with communal and divine energy, became quiet and increasingly overgrown. Nature, patient and persistent, began to reclaim what had been shaped by human hands. Olive trees stretched unchecked. Dust-covered stone. Paths worn by thousands of footsteps grew faint. Despite this decline, the significance of the Olympic Games did not vanish entirely. Their history continued to inspire, even as the practice faded. Texts preserved the names of victors, the distances of races, the feats of wrestlers and charioteers. These records carried a sense of awe and admiration, framing the games as a touchstone of human capability and cultural achievement. Though the sacred practice had ended, the story endured in a way that would allow its rediscovery centuries later. There was a psychological depth to this decline. The cessation of the games was not abrupt or violent in most cases. Rather, it was a quiet slipping away, a fading of attention and devotion over generations. The moral authority of the new faith reshaped priorities, drawing energy and resources away from Olympia. Athletes, parents, spectators, and city-states adjusted gradually, so that by the time the games were officially banned, the communal and spiritual infrastructure that had sustained them for centuries had already weakened. Interestingly, the decline highlighted the resilience of certain values embedded in the tradition. The final years of the ancient Olympic Games were marked not by triumph or ceremony, but by absence, decay, and quiet erosion. Where once the valley of Olympia had resonated with the rhythm of running feet, the grunts of wrestlers, and the thunder of chariots, now only silence remained. This silence was not abrupt, as if the world had shifted overnight, but gradual, creeping in over decades and centuries. It was a silence heavy with absence, filled with the ghosts of effort, rivalry, and devotion that had once animated the sacred ground. To understand this decline, one must imagine Olympia as it existed at its height. The valley was alive with energy, its landscape sculpted not only by nature, but by ritual and human movement. Paths were worn smooth by countless runners, wrestlers, and spectators. Olive trees, carefully preserved and nurtured, lined the sacred grounds. Temples and altars dedicated to Zeus and other deities stood proudly, their stone gleaming in the sun, their presence reinforced by daily offerings and ceremonies. The air was thick with anticipation, dust, and the sharp scent of exertion. Every Olympiad carried not just competition, but the accumulated memory of generations who had come to honor the gods through effort and discipline. Now, imagine that energy slowly evaporating. At first it is subtle. A decline in attendance, a few fewer competitors, perhaps the absence of city-state that once proudly sent its best athletes. These gaps seem minor, almost insignificant in the moment, but they are symptoms of a larger shift. Without the full complement of participants, events lose rhythm. Races are less crowded. Matches are less tense. Victories less remarkable. The mechanisms that sustain the games begin to falter. The moral and spiritual framework that had underpinned Olympia also eroded. Where once athletes swore oaths to Zeus, offering their honesty and effort in sacred recognition, new religious currents question the validity of such acts. Christianity, spreading across the Greek world, increasingly framed participation in pagan festivals as morally problematic. Even those who did not fully embrace the new faith were influenced by its presence. Families began to withhold young men from competition, fearing divine disfavor or social censure. The sacred character of the games, once unquestioned, was now increasingly ambiguous. This uncertainty permeated preparation and training. Where once athletes approached the games with disciplined focus, guided by centuries of tradition, now many hesitated. Without certainty that participation was morally acceptable or socially endorsed, fewer committed fully to preparation. Trainers and mentors, whose authority had long been rooted in ritual and communal recognition, found their influence diminished. Athletic culture began to fragment, losing cohesion as participants questioned both purpose and propriety. Infrastructure, too, suffered from neglect. Temples fell into disrepair. Roofs collapsed. Altars were overgrown with weeds. Olive groves, once meticulously tended, became wild and unmanaged. The carefully worn tracks of the stadium and the wrestling grounds became uneven with time and disuse. Dust settled where human movement had once polished stone and earth. Nature, patient and persistent, reclaimed the space. Even the memories of the games began to fade. Oral traditions, once reinforced every 4 years by observation and participation, became faint. Stories of heroic effort, of remarkable endurance, of legendary victories were no longer repeated with the same fervor. Without active engagement, memory itself weakened. The names of victors that had once been celebrated across Greece receded into obscurity. Texts recorded some, but the vibrancy of communal memory, the shared experience of witnessing effort, was gone. This decline also altered the social and emotional dynamics of Olympia. Where once the presence of rival city-states created a charged but controlled tension, now there were fewer interactions. The ceremonial peace, enforced by the Olympic truce, became less relevant as attendance dwindled. Paths that had once thrummed with anticipation became empty. The air, once alive with human energy, was heavy with stillness. The psychological weight of rivalry, honor, and devotion that had motivated generations of athletes and spectators disappeared gradually, leaving behind only the faint echo of what had been. The cessation of competition did not happen uniformly. In some years, small groups still gathered. Occasional races were held, but these were shadows of former Olympiads. Athletes who competed did so with less prestige, less recognition, and often in the absence of full complement of ritual and spectatorship that had defined the games. The moral and spiritual authority of Zeus and the other deities became increasingly symbolic rather than practical. The sacredness of Olympia, once tangible in every path, every altar, every ritual, now existed primarily in memory. Political and cultural shifts accelerated this decline. As the Roman Empire increasingly adopted Christianity, imperial support for pagan festivals dwindled. Decrees prohibited participation, enforced bans, and redirected public attention to Christian observances. Without the backing of cities and patrons, Olympia could no longer sustain the infrastructure, training, and ritual necessary for meaningful competition. The games, which had survived wars, corruption, and social change for centuries, now faced the slow but inexorable force of religious and political transformation. The human consequences were profound. Athletes who had dedicated years of preparation found their efforts increasingly meaningless in the new moral and social climate. Families, once proud of producing Olympians, now hesitated to encourage participation. Communities lost the cohesion that the games had fostered. Social networks that had revolved around training, competition, and celebration dissolved. Olympia itself, once a hub of culture and identity, became a landscape of absence, its vitality a memory rather than a living reality. This absence had emotional weight. Imagine the last competitor stepping onto the stadium, aware that fewer eyes were watching, fewer oaths were being sworn, fewer sacrifices offered. The experience, once charged with meaning, now fell hollow. The strain of effort remained, but the audience of that effort, both human and divine, had diminished. The psychological intensity that had defined centuries of competition waned. Triumph no longer carried the same resonance. Failure no longer invoked the same collective awareness. Over time, even the physical markers of Olympia began to vanish. Structures crumbled. Stones were repurposed. Altars became indistinct among overgrowth. The stadium, once meticulously maintained, became uneven with erosion and neglect. The paths worn by countless runners, wrestlers, and spectators faded into the earth. Olive groves, carefully pruned for ritual purposes, grew wild and untended. The sacred landscape that had contained humans striving for centuries was increasingly reclaimed by nature, leaving only traces of its former vitality. Centuries passed, and the valley of Olympia settled into a profound and patient silence. The echoes of running feet, the strained breaths of wrestlers, the thundering hooves of chariots, all of it had faded into memory. Nature reclaimed the sacred ground slowly, deliberately, as if to remind the world that even human ambition could not resist time. Olive trees stretched and twisted into shapes that obscured old paths, their roots breaking through stone and soil alike. Rivers flowed quietly, winding around the remains of temples and altars that had once been the focal point of devotion and struggle. Dust settled over the stadium, softening its edges. Wind carried with it the faint whisper of human effort, a memory embedded in the soil. Olympia slept. This was not a sudden or violent disappearance. The decline had begun centuries earlier, with the rise of Christianity, shifting political priorities, and dwindling participation. Yet, the slow accumulation of absence carried a weight of its own. The valley, once alive with ritualized effort, became a space of reflection and quiet desolation. The structures remained, crumbling but stubbornly persistent, monuments to a world that had passed. Yet the meaning that animated them, the moral rigor, the sacred rivalry, the disciplined devotion, was no longer actively expressed. The living rhythm of Olympia had dissolved, leaving behind only residue. Over the decades, the physical decay of Olympia mirrored the fading memory of its rituals. Temples that had once gleamed in the sun were breached by vegetation. Statues, worn by wind and rain, leaned precariously, some toppled entirely. Paths, once polished smooth by thousands of feet, became uneven and overgrown. The carefully cultivated olive groves, would have been tended as a sacred labor, expanded unchecked, their canopies interweaving over altars and stadium seating. The riverbanks, once cleared to provide access, now narrowed with reeds and brush. The valley retained its shape, but its function had disappeared. Human absence transformed Olympia in more subtle ways as well. Where once visitors had carried incense, shouted encouragement, and observed competitors with rapt attention, silence now held sway. The collective energy that had marked the games, the anticipation, anxiety, rivalry, and awe, was gone. Time itself seemed to stretch differently in the valley, no longer measured by Olympiads or cycles of ritual, but by the slow accrual of seasons and years. The human imprint, while still present in stone, earth, and myth, was now a memory rather than an active force. In the absence of living participants, memory became the primary custodian of Olympia's significance. Stories of heroic effort, once recited in rhythm with ongoing competition, were preserved in texts, oral traditions, and the occasional traveler's account. The names of victors, the outcomes of races, the feats of strength and endurance, all became part of an archival consciousness. Yet without ongoing practice, these narratives became increasingly abstract, existing in imagination rather than in the lived experience of bodies straining beneath the sky. Archaeology, in its earliest forms, would centuries later attempt to reconstruct what had been lost, but the process was inherently incomplete. Stones and fragments provided evidence of structure, but they could not convey the sound of footfalls, the tension of a wrestling match, or the ephemeral excitement of victory. The living experience of Olympia, its dust, its sweat, its noise, was irretrievably gone. What remained was memory codified in record and imagination, a shadow of the intense human engagement that had once defined the games. The moral and spiritual dimensions of Olympia, while diminished, continue to influence thought. Philosophers and poets reference the games as models of virtue, endurance, and human striving. Even as the physical practices ceased, their significance endured as ideals. The concepts of discipline, courage, and honor, once manifested in competition, became abstract principles. Writers reflected on the lessons of the games, linking physical effort to moral and civic virtue, even when corporeal contests had ended. This transition illustrates the persistence of cultural memory. The physical expression of tradition may fade, but symbolic and ethical resonance can endure. Environmental processes continue to shape the valley over centuries. Erosion softened the once precise contours of the stadium. Stones fractured under the influence of freeze and thaw. Roots undermined foundations. Vegetation spread, reclaiming cleared spaces. Insects, birds, and small animals became the primary occupants, filling niches once dominated by human presence. The valley transformed into a quiet ecological system, yet one structured by the remnants of human intervention. The shapes of the temples, the stadium, and the pathways influence patterns of growth and movement, demonstrating that human activity leaves traces even after the purpose that generated them has disappeared. The social memory of Olympia persisted even as the physical site decayed. Stories of victors and feats circulated across the Greek world and beyond, informing cultural ideals of excellence and moral effort. Travelers, scholars, and historians recorded their observations, preserving fragments of the game's significance. These accounts, while secondhand and increasingly mythologized, maintained a sense of continuity. Olympia became a symbol, a touchstone for discussions of discipline, morality, and communal effort. Even without active participants, the decay of the valley also carried emotional resonance. For those who had witnessed or participated in the games, the empty stadiums and overgrown paths were bittersweet reminders of mortality, change, and impermanence. The silence amplified the absence, creating a sense of loss that was both personal and communal. Even those generations removed from the last Olympiad could sense the weight of history in the landscape, the echo of human striving embedded in stone and soil. Over time, Olympia's decline was compounded by broader cultural and political changes. The decline of the Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity, and shifting social priorities all reduced attention and resources available to preserve the site. Religious and civic energies that had sustained the games were redirected. Without active participation or institutional support, the physical and symbolic structures of Olympia could not endure in their original form. The interplay of cultural, religious, and environmental forces accelerated the valley's transition from a site of vibrant practice to one of quiet reflection. Yet even in this prolonged absence, Olympia's legacy persisted. The ideals cultivated through centuries of competition, discipline, endurance, and moral courage remained embedded in the Greek cultural imagination. Philosophical and literary traditions reference the games as exemplars of human striving. Civic ideals continue to draw on the symbolism of victory, effort, and honor. The games' disappearance did not erase their influence. Rather, it transformed it from practical expression into symbolic and ethical reference. Visitors to Olympia centuries later experienced the site differently from its original participants. They approached ruins and overgrown paths with reverence, interpreting traces of structure as markers of human aspiration. The silence and decay evoked reflection rather than competition. The valley became a place where absence itself carried meaning, a landscape which the imprint of human effort was preserved not in activity, but in memory, story, and material trace. The slow reclamation of the valley by nature also emphasizes the interplay between human achievement and environmental persistence. Structures that once directed human movement now influenced ecological patterns. The stadium's slope guided water flow. Pathways, though overgrown, created corridors for vegetation and small animals. Temples and altars, though fragmented, provided niches for birds and plants. Even as human use disappeared, the environment adapted to and integrated the remnants of human labor. This interplay between memory, environment, and absence illustrates a broader lesson about cultural persistence. Human practices, no matter how intense or essential to daily life, are vulnerable to shifts in belief, politics, and society. Yet the values and ideals embedded within those practices can endure, even as physical forms decay. Olympia became a testament not to ongoing activity, but to the long-term resonance of cultural and moral ideals. Its decline did not erase the lessons learned there. Discipline, endurance, courage, and honor remain instructive across generations, even as the stadiums fell silent. The psychological impact of Olympia's absence on subsequent generations cannot be overstated. The valley, overgrown and empty, provided a stark contrast to the bustling energy of the game's height. It evoked reflection on impermanence, mortality, and the fleeting nature of human achievement. For scholars, pilgrims, and curious travelers, Olympia became a space of contemplation, linking past human effort with present observation. Its ruins reminded visitors that even monumental traditions are subject to decay, yet the moral and cultural resonance of those traditions can persist beyond physical existence. In its final centuries of absence, Olympia existed as both historical site and symbolic landscape. Its stones, trees, and river paths became markers of human memory. The stadium, though no longer used, traced the patterns of ancient races and contests. The altars, though unattended, continued to symbolize devotion and moral effort. The valley as a whole served as a silent teacher, communicating the lessons of human discipline, striving, and cultural continuity to those willing to observe and reflect. Even as the centuries continued to pass, the legacy of Olympia influenced the world beyond its valley. Stories of heroic effort and virtuous competition informed education, philosophy, and cultural identity. Texts preserved the chronology of victors, the feats of athletes, and the moral lessons embedded in the games. Scholars drew on these accounts to explore the intersections of physical and moral excellence, connecting the ideals cultivated at Olympia to broader cultural and ethical frameworks. The games' influence extended far beyond their temporal existence, demonstrating the enduring power of cultural memory. In this prolonged period of sleep and forgetting, Olympia became a repository not only of physical traces, but of ideals. Its silence reinforced the value of effort and discipline as abstract principles, even in the absence of living practice. The overgrown paths and crumbling altars reminded observers that human endeavor, though temporary, leaves enduring traces in memory and culture. The valley, reclaimed by nature yet marked indelibly by human action, embodied the tension between impermanence and legacy. The centuries of absence transformed Olympia into a reflective landscape, a place where the human imagination could reconstruct meaning from remnants. Visitors could trace the stadium, imagine the runners, and consider the exertion and moral effort required for competition. Even without active games, the valley communicated the values that had once animated it. Its silence was not emptiness, but a form of presence, emphasizing what had been, what had endured, and what could still be remembered. Ultimately, the centuries of sleep and forgetting reveal a profound truth about human culture. The cessation of practice does not necessitate the disappearance of meaning. Physical activities may fade, but the moral, cultural, and ethical frameworks embedded within them persist through memory, story, and reflection. Olympia, once a center of action, became a monument to this principle, demonstrating that even in absence, human achievement continues to resonate, teaching lessons about effort, discipline, honor, and the fleeting yet enduring nature of cultural life. Through dust, overgrowth, and silence, Olympia's legacy endured. It transformed from a space of action into a space of contemplation. Its stones, trees, and paths became witnesses to history, preserving the imprint of generations who had competed, sacrificed, and aspired beneath the open sky. And in this quiet endurance, the valley taught a final lesson: that the essence of human striving, once fully expressed, can survive even the slow, patient reclamation of time and nature, echoing across centuries long after the last Olympiad has passed into memory. Even as centuries passed, the Valley of Olympia continued to resonate in subtle ways, though not with the thundering energy of human competition, but with memory, myth, and the quiet imprint of history. The stones of the stadium, the remnants of the temples, and the roots of the ancient olive trees all bore silent witness to a civilization's highest aspirations and deepest vulnerabilities. These relics were more than architectural or agricultural features. They were repositories of human effort, persistence, and devotion. The story of the Olympics had shifted from active ritual to enduring legacy, and in this shift lay a profound lesson about cultural transmission, memory, and the persistence of ideals beyond physical practice. The decay of Olympia was gradual and relentless. Once pristine altars crumbled under the influence of wind and rain, the marble worn away by centuries of exposure. Statues, crafted with care to honor the gods or immortalize victors, fractured and toppled, some buried under sediment, others overtaken by invasive roots. The stadium itself, which had once echoed with the pounding of countless feet, became uneven as soil accumulated and vegetation spread unchecked. Paths that had been polished smooth by repetition grew rough and irregular, their edges softened by erosion. Even the rivers, which had been carefully managed to flow past temples and sanctuaries, gradually reclaimed their natural courses, submerging parts of sacred structures or altering the orientation of human activity. In these processes, nature slowly absorbed the marks of civilization, preserving the memory of human activity, while reshaping it according to its own rhythms. Despite this transformation, Olympia remained a locus of human imagination. Scholars, travelers, and poets visiting the site centuries later were struck not by its emptiness, but by its residual power. They could trace the stadion's length and imagine the racers straining for victory, their muscles taut and faces set in determination. They could observe the foundations of temples and visualize altars adorned with offerings, feeling the spiritual weight that had once structured the valley. Even as active participation ceased, the spatial and symbolic arrangements of the site conveyed meaning, allowing future generations to reconstruct, mentally and emotionally, the experiences of those who had competed there. In this sense, Olympia became a pedagogical landscape, teaching through observation and reflection rather than through ritual or competition. The moral and cultural legacy of the Games persisted even as the physical site decayed. Philosophers and historians continued to reference Olympia as an exemplar of human excellence, moral discipline, and civic virtue. The concept of narrate, the pursuit of excellence and virtue, remained central to Greek thought, even in an era when the Olympic rituals had ended. The Games served as a paradigm for discussing the balance of physical and moral effort, the cultivation of courage, the acceptance of struggle, and the recognition of achievement. Even as participation became impossible, the ethical framework embodied by Olympia retained its resonance, influencing education, literature, and philosophical discourse. Part of the enduring power of Olympia lay in its ability to evoke human aspiration. Visitors centuries later often described a palpable sense of effort that seemed embedded in the landscape itself. Walking along the stadium, they could imagine the rhythm of footsteps, the tension of muscles, the anticipation of starting and finishing lines. Observing the ruins of the temples, they could sense the weight of prayer, sacrifice, and ritual, even if the gods were no longer honored in the same way. This imaginative reconstruction allowed the Olympic ideals to survive in cultural memory, demonstrating that human striving can persist symbolically even when the practices that generated it have ceased. The environmental reclamation of Olympia also contributed to its symbolic resonance. Overgrown olive groves and wild vegetation blurred the boundaries between natural and human-made space, creating a landscape where past effort and present wilderness coexisted. Roots broke through stone, intertwining human and natural history in complex patterns. The rivers, no longer directed for ritual convenience, reflected the passage of time and the persistence of the landscape's ecological processes. These transformations underscore the impermanence of human institutions, while simultaneously preserving traces of their influence. Olympia's decline was not erasure. It was integration into a broader, enduring system that continued to communicate meaning. Historical accounts and inscriptions played a crucial role in preserving the legacy of the Games. Lists of victors, records of distances, and descriptions of events allowed future generations to engage with Olympia intellectually, even as the valley itself fell silent. These texts were more than documentation. They were instruments of cultural memory, encoding the values, ideals, and practices of centuries of human endeavor. The recording of achievements reinforced the importance of moral and physical excellence, even when active observation was impossible. Through these records, the legacy of the Games became portable, capable of influencing distant regions and later societies that had no direct experience of Olympia. The psychological impact of visiting the silent, overgrown valley was profound. Travelers often describe feelings of awe, melancholy, and reflection. The absence of human activity heightened awareness of the past, emphasizing the fleeting nature of even the most celebrated achievements. The ruins acted as moral and philosophical prompts, encouraging contemplation of effort, mortality, and the persistence of ideals. In this sense, Olympia transformed from a site of performance to a site of reflection, where the absence of activity conveyed meaning as powerfully as any act of competition could. Even as centuries passed, the physical layout of Olympia preserved the structure of competition and ritual.